when Mary was just a little girl, she would watch her parents fight all the time. They had a lot of struggles in their marriage, and they needed help, but they never got the help that they needed. And so the dysfunction just continued on for years. Fast forward to when Mary was in high school, her mom came to her and she said, "I want to divorce your dad." Mary didn't really know what to say to that, so she told her, "I just want the fighting to stop." And her mom went through with the divorce, which honestly seemed like a solution to a really bad, messy situation, but it just made things worse for Mary. It was just one problem, one trauma on top of another. And up to that point, Mary told me that she didn't really act out. She held her pain inside, but that all changed when she went to college. She got into the party scene. She started drinking heavily. That led to dating the wrong guys. She ended up marrying one of those guys who was a drug addict and an alcoholic, and their marriage was obviously a mess as well. Before long, they get pregnant. And because she was terrified that her baby would grow up in that hell, she got an abortion, which obviously brought a ton more pain into her life. And following that, she divorced her husband, repeating the cycle started by her parents, which is super common. Some studies say people from divorced families are 2 to 3 times more likely to get divorced themselves. And once the dust settled, she fell into a deep depression and dealt with emotional problems for years. And whenever I think of Mary, I can't help but think, what if? What if someone was there to help her? What if someone was there to get her professional help? What if someone was there to teach her how to deal with her pain in healthy ways instead of unhealthy ways? What if someone was there to help her learn how to find a virtuous spouse and how to build a healthy relationship? I'm super convinced, and I know she would agree with me, that had she had that help, her life would not have turned into the tragedy that it became. Now, I wish I could tell you that stories like Mary's, people like Mary, were rare, but the truth is, according to the US Census, every year, over 1 million American children go through their parents' divorce. They define child as anyone 17 and younger. That doesn't include situations where the parents are separated or situations where the parents were never married to begin with, which is becoming more and more popular today. So that means right now there's tens of millions of people like Mary who've been through the trauma of their parents' divorce, and most of them haven't gotten the help they needed. And this is true even if their stories are not as dramatic as Mary's. Like Mary, I also come from a divorced and broken family. When I was 11 years old, my parents separated, and it just came totally out of the blue for me. I thought everything was fine in my family, and then my mom set me and my siblings down to break the news that they were getting divorced. And in that moment, my whole world just shattered. I didn't know what to do with that news. And as a boy, not knowing what to do, I just hid in the closet and cried. And sitting there in that closet, I felt abandoned. I felt unwanted. I felt like I just wasn't good enough, even though my parents didn't intend that. And in the months and years that followed, I dealt with all sorts of pain and problems. I dealt with emotional problems like anxiety, depression, loneliness, anger. I dealt with relationship struggles, struggling to build healthy relationships, not knowing how to trust, to be vulnerable. I felt terrified of love and relationships. I didn't want to get married. And then also I fell into bad habits. Around that time, a friend of mine introduced me to pornography, and so that became my drug of choice. It was my way of numbing the pain that I was experiencing. But even as a boy, I knew I wanted to be happy, and porn wasn't making me happy. In the moment, it felt good, but then afterward, I felt so empty. And so I knew that I needed to change, and 2 things really helped. I heard speaker Jason Everett give a chastity talk, and so I started to put his advice into action and live a pure life. I got porn out of my life, and that helped a ton. I also made new friends. These friends were genuinely happy, and I wanted to be like them. And so I started to do what they did. They were authentic Catholics, and so I started to pray, learn my faith, and build virtue, and that helped a ton too. But even with that, I still felt broken and going into high school and into college. And so I learned that after sin, the thing that prevents us from becoming the best version of ourselves is our untreated brokenness. And so I knew that I needed to heal, so I looked around for some help. And I was shocked to find nothing practical for a young person like me who came from a broken family. And the reason that shocked me is I looked at my siblings and I saw how they were struggling. I looked at close friends of mine who were going through their parents' divorce, and I saw how they were struggling, often in serious ways. And then I started reading the research and just understanding this is a huge, serious problem, but for some reason, no one's talking about it and no one's really doing anything about it. And so some years later, after spending time in the business world, I decided to do something about it because I believe that that's wrong, that this group of people is neglected. And so I started a nonprofit called Restored. We help teenagers and young adults who come from broken families, divorced families, to heal and build virtue so they can feel whole again and break that cycle of dysfunction and divorce in their own lives. And we do so by producing content that makes healing and building virtue simple. And so it's really what I wish I would have had years ago, and that's what this talk is too. And so if you come from a divorced family, a separated family, or there's just a lot of dysfunction at home, I'm so glad you're here, that you're watching this. I want to tell you the things that I wish someone told me years ago, and in doing that, I want to answer a few questions. The first question is, how does divorce affect the children? If you watched the talk yesterday or were here live, there's going to be some overlapping content because anyone who didn't really needs to hear this. I also want to talk about what can we do to cope with our pain in healthy ways instead of unhealthy ways. And then what are some simple tactics that we can use to heal? And then finally, how can we build healthy relationships and even prepare for or build a thriving and divorce-proof marriage? To anyone watching right now who's divorced or separated, you parents out there, please know that I'm not here to condemn you or judge you. I mentioned this yesterday as well. It's a sensitive topic, and I just want to be respectful of that. I don't know your situation, and so I'm not here to judge you. I'm so sorry for what you've been through. I'm sure it's been extremely painful. Tonight, I'm here to help your children and to help them to be healthy, to be whole, and to thrive in life, and ultimately have a great relationship with you. And so to do that, we need to talk about some uncomfortable things, but I only do that in order to help. So the first question is, how does divorce affect the children? Like I said, there's a little bit of overlap to the other talk. Well, and by extension, how does separation and extreme dysfunction affect the children? Well, the research shows that children of divorce are more likely to have social problems, behavioral problems. They're more likely to struggle in their relationship with their parents, more likely to struggle in romantic relationships. They're more likely to get divorced. They're more likely to struggle with depression and violence. They're at higher risk for suicidal attempts, more health problems, less success in school, more emotional problems, and lower self-esteem. And it wasn't just like one study that found that. Some of those findings are from national data, but another source is a meta-analysis. A meta-analysis, if you're not familiar, is where researchers, instead of conducting their own study, they look at studies that have already been conducted and summarize their findings. This meta-analysis looked at 67 different studies on children of divorce. It was published in the Journal of Family Psychology by Professor Paul Amato, who's a sociologist at Penn State and a leading researcher on the topic of divorce. Another researcher who spent a lot of time studying children of divorce was Dr. Judith Wallerstein. She studied them for 25 years, and she reported her findings in the great book, The Unexpected Legacy of Divorce. And in her research, she studied 131 young people from 60 families. And one important detail is she only chose children who didn't have any developmental or emotional problems prior to the divorce, and then she observed the effects that the divorce had on them and compared them to their peers who came from intact families. And by the way, going into the research, she thought that she would find that divorce didn't have any effect on them. And if it did, it would be short-lived, it would be temporary. That was a prevailing thought at the time, but after years of researching it, she said this. She said, "Our findings challenge the myth that divorce is a transient crisis, and that as soon as parents reestablish their lives, the children will recover fully. That doesn't happen." She found that children of divorce were less likely to get married, they're more likely to get divorced, less likely to have children, much more likely to heavily use drugs or alcohol during high school, less likely to finish high school, less likely to go to college, more likely to drop out, far less likely to receive financial support from their parents for college, and the men were far less likely to enter an intimate relationship. And reflecting on all this, Dr. Judith said, "Parents like to believe if they are unhappy in their marriage, the children also will be unhappy. Conversely, if divorce is better for them, it will be better for the children." But things don't work that way. Children frequently do not share their parents' unhappiness with a problematic marriage, while a divorce brings pain into their lives that until now has gone unrecognized. We are allowing the children to bear the psychological, economic, and moral brunt of divorce. Two main takeaways from her research. One, she said, the full effects from your parents' divorce actually aren't experienced until adulthood. It doesn't mean you're not affected before then, but she said the full effects come out around college age or beyond. She also said the area of your life that's most impacted by your parents' divorce is your own relationships, especially your own future marriage, which we'll get into a little bit later. Another woman with a deep insight into this problem is Catholic author Layla Miller. She kind of stumbled upon this problem when a close friend of hers would frequently talk about how difficult it was to endure her parents' divorce and all the after effects of it. And the interesting thing is her friend was in her late 30s, early 40s. She had children. She was married herself. Her parents had divorced years prior, but she was still talking about how challenging it was for her. And so Layla was intrigued, even though she comes from an intact family. Her parents had a great marriage. But she went on Facebook, and to her following, she said, if any of you are children of divorce, you come from divorced families, I want you to just answer these 8 questions. If you want to answer it, just private message me, and that's it. Within a few days, she had over 100 responses. She was blown away. She knew she hit a nerve. And so she took 70 of those stories and compiled them into a book. The book is called Primal Loss, The Now Adult Children of Divorce Speak. It's a good read. It's a heavy read, but I recommend it. It gives a lot of insight into it, especially if you come from a divorced or broken family. It will help you really empathize with those people and know that you're not alone. One takeaway from that book is that the authors typically were in their 30s, 40s, and 50s. They all wrote anonymously, but you knew their ages. And even though for the majority of them, their parents' divorce had happened years prior, they were still struggling with the negative effects, often silently. And so by now, I hope it's clear that enduring your parents' divorce is traumatic, and the effects are serious and long-lasting. And then this is similar for cases of separation and extreme dysfunction at home. Even though mom and dad are still together, they might act like they're divorced. And by the way, these findings are even true in cases where divorce might be necessary for the protection of one of the spouses or the children. If there's abuse or violence, we would always say, get to safety, right? But even if that's better, it's still difficult for the children, right? It's still difficult for them to go through the divorce. Everything that led up to the divorce, everything during the divorce and after the divorce still wears on them, just like it does the parents. Divorce isn't this magic pill that makes all the pain and the problems go away. And so pretty heavy, depressing stuff. But thankfully, there's a lot we can do to heal, to grow, and to move on in life. We're not meant to stay stuck in our brokenness. We're meant to close that chapter in our lives and move on. But honestly, as a culture, we really need to wake up. We need to wake up to the damage of divorce. We become so numb to this problem, to brokenness within our families, because it's so common. And whenever I give this talk to big audiences, I always ask them, how many of you come from a broken family where your parents are separated or divorced, or you know someone who does? It's always 100%. Like, we all know someone who comes from a divorced family, or maybe we are the ones who do. To any of you watching right now who come from a divorced family, there's a few things I just want to say to you. First is, I'm so sorry for what you've had to endure. It breaks my heart. I get it. I've been through it. I want you to know that what you went through was actually an injustice. And I don't say that to hate on parents in any way, but just know that I believe that every child deserves a healthy family and a mom and a dad who love each other and stick together. And no matter the circumstances, that was taken from you. I want you to know, too, that it's not your fault. For one reason or another, we often blame ourselves or feel responsible. Please know it's not your fault. You didn't cause it. There's nothing you could have done to prevent it, and there's nothing you can do, unfortunately, to fix it. Your parents are the ones who would have to do that. It's not your responsibility. And what I usually say is the problems that led to your parents' split were likely there long before you were. And we can talk about that during the Q&A if you'd like. I want you to know that you're not doomed to repeat your parents' mistakes or dysfunction. I know they wouldn't want that for you either. You can write your own story, and I hope this talk will give you some advice and some tools to do just that. And then finally, just know that you're not alone. We often feel alone, even though there's so many of us out there, but please know that you're not alone. And I'm going to offer some resources throughout the talk, and especially at the end, to help you feel less alone and to navigate the pain and the problems you have to deal with, and even to find healing. So the next question is, how do we cope with the pain and the problems that a broken family brings in healthy ways? What I've seen typically, and I've experienced in my life, is the default seems to be to cope with pain and problems in our lives in unhealthy ways. And we all know what this looks like, right? Porn, drinking, drugs, sleeping around, cutting, binging on video games, Netflix, social, whatever. The list is endless. These extremes, these unhealthy behaviors that give us some relief, some escape, some good feeling. And the question is really, why do we do this? Like if things are bad for us and we know they'll ultimately be bad for us, why do we do it? I think it's simple. When we feel bad, when we feel numb, we want to feel good or just feel something, even if that behavior isn't good for us. And so to cope in healthy ways, what we need is emotional agility. Emotional agility. That term was coined by Dr. Susan David from the Harvard Medical School. She has a book by the same name, Emotional Agility, and she defines it as the ability to feel and face your emotions. You're not hiding from them, shoving them away, ignoring them. You're facing them. And then second, to choose your response in a way that aligns with your deepest held beliefs. We would call that virtue. So how can you develop emotional agility? She offers 3 tips that I want to share. The first is to create a space between stimulus and response. She quotes Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist who wrote the awesome book, Man's Search for Meaning. And he said this. He said, between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. I want to repeat that. Between stimulus, the thing that makes you feel something, and response, the way we react to it, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. And so basically what he's advising is that we lengthen the space between stimulus and response by pausing, by slowing down, by taking a step back physically or emotionally, by detaching from the intensity of our emotions and using our minds and our wills to choose what is good. She also says to remember that you are not your thoughts, you are not your feelings. You have thoughts and you have feelings, but you are not them and they are not you. And this is helpful since your emotions can often feel like they can control you or define you, but they don't. And remember that messy emotions are how you're doing, not who you are. And you can still choose to do what's good when you feel them. Lastly, she says to label your emotions. She tells a story, if you were listening or watching yesterday, you would have heard this story. She tells a story about a business executive named Thomas. One day when Thomas got to the office, he had a seizure. So the paramedics came, took him to the hospital. They ran a bunch of tests, and the doctor came in to Thomas, and he said, Thomas, we know this was scary, this was traumatic, really difficult thing to go through. But thankfully, based on all the data that we're seeing, you should never have another seizure. Right? It's just very, very slim that you'll have another seizure. But Thomas became obsessed with this idea that he would have another seizure to the point where he lost everything. He lost his wife, his job, his home. And years later, when he was living on the streets, he was working with Dr. Susan David in therapy. And one of the things she noticed about him is whenever she would ask how he was doing, how things were going, he would always respond in a similar way. It was the South African equivalent of, I'm fine, things are fine. One day she was asking him how he was doing, how his mom was doing, and because his mom was the one who was really there for him through all the mess that he had been through. And he responded, he said, things are fine. She died. And in that moment, Dr. Susan realized that Thomas suffered from a condition called alexithymia. Alexithymia is the inability to distinguish between and put into words your emotions. And that inability, that disability, greatly impacted his ability to cope with that trauma that he had been through and move on in life. And so she encourages us in her book to learn to recognize and label your emotions. And if you don't, she says that they might come out in anger or some other unhealthy way of coping. And one of the things I've learned as well is another way to avoid that unhealthy coping and cope in healthy ways is simply filling your legitimate human needs. What I've noticed in my work with young people who come from divorced or broken families is that so often we neglect our needs for one reason or another. But if you do take care of yourself, you're going to remove so much temptation off the table. And so make a simple plan to take care of yourself in 4 areas. Author and speaker Matthew Kelly often talks about these 4 areas. Your body, your soul, your heart, and your mind. So what does your body need? Your body needs good sleep, good nutrition, including water, high-quality food, and exercise, some form of movement. Your soul needs God's grace. God's grace is God's life inside of us, which obviously comes through intimacy with God, through the sacraments as well. We're really made for that. And then also our soul needs experiences of goodness, of truth, and of beauty. For some people, it looks like beautiful music, a sunset, incredible experiences, good Italian food. Those experiences of goodness, truth, and beauty can really give us life, feed our souls. Our hearts need intimacy, friendship. We need people to love us and people to love, to know us, and to know them. And our minds, what I've realized is our minds need challenges. We need to learn new things in order to stay sharp. And so my challenge to you is just pick one area, perhaps the area that you're most weak in or neglecting the most. Just make a simple plan to take care of yourself in that way this week. Now, as much as these self-help tips are helpful, I think they can be good. I think God gave them to them. Not all of them. Some of them are quite wacky. I think they're helpful, but I think what's more helpful is the example of a man who suffered so much, who dealt with so much pain in his life, and that man is St. John Paul II. When he was 8 years old, his mother died. When he was 11 years old, his brother died. When he was 19, the Nazis invaded Poland. When he was 20, his father died, leaving him all alone without any family. At 24, he was struck by a truck and knocked unconscious for 18 hours. When he was 25, the Nazis left Poland, but then the Soviets took over, and in many ways, they were worse than the Nazis. He was almost killed multiple times, and all this, all the pain and all the problems that he had been through, weighed on him. He said this to one of his friends. He said, "At times I feel great oppression, depression, despair, and evil." And so even this incredibly holy man was not immune to the pain and evil around him. And as Pope, we all know that he suffered multiple, assassination attempts. He dislocated his shoulder. He broke his femur. He had to undergo multiple surgeries. And at the end of his life, he had to deal with arthritis, Parkinson's disease, and loss of hearing. And so how did this man, the saint, handle his pain? And what can we learn from him? I think there's 4 main lessons. The first lesson is to respond to pain with love. He wrote this. He said, "Faced with problems and disappointments, many people will try to escape their responsibility. Escape in selfishness, escape in sexual pleasure, escape in drugs, escape in violence, escape in indifference and cynical attitudes. But today I propose to you the option of love, which is the opposite of escape." John Paul knew that the antidote to evil, to sin, is love, even loving those who cause you pain. In other words, he knew that love is the greatest weapon in the world against evil. And so the first lesson, respond to pain and problems with love. Lesson 2 is know the value of suffering and don't waste it. Don't waste it. In his last days, when he was very debilitated, he said, "I've written many encyclicals and many apostolic letters, but I realize that it is only with my suffering that I could best help mankind. Think of the value of pain suffered and offered with love." His first trip out of the Vatican as Pope was actually to the hospital nearby to visit one of his friends from seminary. When he was there, he asked the patients to pray for him, to pray for his papacy, because he knew how powerful their prayers were when united with their suffering and the suffering of Jesus on the cross. In writing about suffering, he said, "It is this suffering which burns and consumes evil with the flame of love and draws forth, even from sin, a great flowering of good. All human suffering, all pain, all infirmity contains within itself a promise of salvation, a promise of joy." And so the challenge here is to unite your suffering to Jesus. God can bring good out of it. And so lesson number 2 is to know the value of suffering and don't waste it. Lesson 3, draw close to God in the midst of suffering. Many people who, go through what John Paul went through would probably grow bitter, would probably reject God. And in many ways, he had a lot of reasons, at least the world would say, to reject God, but he didn't. Through all of that, he drew closer to God. And it's said that his righteous anger exploded, not as revenge, but as love. And how does that happen? How does that happen? I think because he had a deep interior life. He had intimacy with God on a very deep level, and from that intimacy came interior strength to endure the pain, to choose good, and to avoid evil, and even fight evil. And so draw close to God in the midst of suffering, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But lesson 3 is to draw close to God in the midst of suffering. Lesson 4, don't take life so serious. There's a story when he was sick, he had Parkinson's disease. The sisters, the nuns who would take care of him, one of them came to him and said, I'm worried about your holiness. And he looked at her and he said, I'm worried about my holiness too. Some months before he died, a Spanish bishop came to have lunch with him. And at the end of lunch, the bishop looked at John Paul II and he said, Holy Father, this is probably the last time that I'll see you. And kind of jokingly, he looked at him and said, why? What's the matter? Are you sick? And so don't take life so seriously. So some great lessons from the life of John Paul II. But if, coping is about enduring, surviving, getting by, healing is about overcoming and thriving. If you were to Google the word healing, the definition is the process of becoming healthy and whole. And so imagine that I were to, fall down the stairs on my way out of the church today and I were to break my arm. I would go to the hospital. The doctors would inspect the wound, the injury. They might do an x-ray, give me some medicine. They'd put it in a cast. And then, in weeks, I would get the cast off, weeks or months, get the cast off. I would do some physical therapy and hopefully regain full function of my arm. My arm would be healthy and whole. Similar to physical healing, we need to heal our emotional wounds as well. And a story that just shows this so well is the story of Christelina Everett. Her earliest memory is of her dad hitting her mom. When she was a little girl, she was sexually abused. In high school, she got into drugs, partying, alcohol, sleeping around. And it wasn't until she heard a chastity talk in high school that she turned everything around. She started saving herself for her marriage, for her husband. And so life got better for her. But it wasn't until she was married, she became a wife and a mother, where her brokenness started to surface. She started dealing with a lot of messy emotions, and it was coming out on her husband and on her kids. And when she realized that for so long, she had just stuffed away her wounds, her brokenness, ignored them. And again, now it was coming out on the people that she loved the most, and that freaked her out. She did not want to continue that cycle of brokenness. And so she said, it stops with me. It stops with me. And so she dedicated herself to healing. She got a spiritual director, a counselor. She did a lot of adoration. And for 3 years, she went through this intense process. But by the end, she felt so transformed, so free, so much lighter, so much confident, more confident as a woman, a stronger woman, a better wife, a better mother. And she said that she wasn't ashamed of her past anymore. She kind of closed that chapter in her life. And that's what healing is meant to do. It's meant to transform you. It doesn't mean you'll never suffer again, but it means that you are better, you are stronger, you are more virtuous, and you're better able to move beyond those painful chapters in your life. And so how do you heal? I remember asking a lot of smart people when I was growing up this question, and I was never really satisfied with the answers because they always seemed kind of vague. And so I want to go into some tactics that you can use. The first tactic is to engage your story. Engage your story. Each of us has a story, as if our lives were a novel or a movie. And to engage our story means to reflect on it in an active, constructive way. And the most important part that we can reflect on is our relationships, especially the relationships that formed us, our relationship with our parents. Now, this might seem really simplistic. Like, does this really help heal you? But reflecting on your story is actually healing on a neurobiological level. What do I mean? Well, neurobiologists tell us that one measure of brain health is neural connectivity. So imagine your brain is this big web, like spider webs, right? Neural connectivity means the connections your brain has. And so by reflecting on your story, your brain actually creates more connections. Your brain is healthier. You are healthier. Another tactic here, kind of going beyond reflecting on your story, is sharing your story with someone who can receive it with empathy and without judgment. That, again, is also healing on a neurobiological level. It's also important to name your wounds. On the great podcast, The Place We Find Ourselves, therapist Adam Young encourages his listeners to be very specific with naming their wounds, even to make a list of the ways in which they were harmed so that they can heal and move on. And he says this, he says, when it comes to experiencing healing, naming how you've been harmed is about 70% of the battle. The idea is really simple here. It's necessary to first diagnose your wounds before you can heal them. The next tip is to write about emotionally significant events in your life. Dr. James Penbaker, after a few years into marriage, he and his wife were really doubting their marriage. They were doubting that they should have gotten married. And he fell into depression, dealt with loneliness. And one day when he was locked at home, he saw his typewriter. This was some years back. And so he got out his typewriter and he just started writing about everything that he was experiencing. No filter. And he did this for a few days. And after 3 days, something amazing happened. His depression just left him. And so he spent the rest of his career, even to this day, 40 plus years, researching the link between writing and emotional processing or healing. And what he would do in his research is he would take a group of people, split them in two, and say to group one, you guys write about emotionally significant events in your life. To group two, he'd say, you guys just write about monotonous everyday thing like your shoes or the weather. Do it for 20 minutes a day, both groups, 4 days in a row, that's it. And what they found is that the people who wrote about the emotionally significant events in their lives had an increase in physical and mental well-being. They were happier, less depressed, less anxious. They reported higher quality relationships, better memory, more success at work, and there's been thousands of studies that have confirmed these findings. Dr. Penbaker has books that will guide you in his very specific writing style so you can get unstuck and move on. And it's not the same as journaling, by the way. There's very specific methods to it. The next tip is to find a coach to help you heal. There's two types of coaches that I recommend, of course. One is counseling. And the goal of counseling is really to help you diagnose your brokenness, to understand it, and then to heal those wounds so you can get unstuck and become the best you. Spiritual direction is not counseling, right? The goal of spiritual direction is to discern God's plan for your life and to grow closer to God. And it can even be helpful in healing your relationship with God if there's some serious barriers there. But the challenge always is how do you find a competent counselor and a trained spiritual director? Thankfully, my team and I were working on this problem at Restored, at my nonprofit. We're building a referral network of counselors, spiritual directors, mentors, coaches that we trust and recommend. And I'll mention our website at the end. Next tip, ask God to heal you. Again, these self-help tips, I think they're helpful, but we can't heal ourselves on our own. We're going to hit a ceiling at a certain point. We need God to heal us. He can heal us in ways that we can never heal ourselves. And so my invitation is to ask Jesus as the divine physician to heal you. When he knocks at the door of your heart, at the door of your life, don't hold back. Open the door to him. Show him your brokenness. Show him your wounds. Don't just show him the good parts of your life. Show him the ugly parts, the parts that you're ashamed of. And then ask him and let him heal that wound. So often we just don't want to rely on God. We want to take care of things ourselves. We push him away. But remember that your brokenness doesn't make him love you less. It actually makes him love you more. On this topic, Jesus told St. Faustina, he said, the greater the sinner, the greater the right he has to my mercy. Before I mentioned that grace can help us cope with our pain, our suffering, it could actually heal us too. Grace heals nature. It helps us to do good and avoid evil. That's one of the functions of grace in our souls. And so make use of the sacraments, of course. They can be healing in and of themselves. Build a deep interior life through personal prayer with Jesus. This is often so hard to stay disciplined on. So if you struggle there, I get it. There's 3 things I want to recommend. One is to set a time every day for you to pray. It can be as simple as 10, 15, 20 minutes of you having conversation with God. Set a place every day. Same time, same place, every day. And then one of the things that's been helpful for me lately is start your prayer with some form of content. Whether you do Bible in a Year by Father Mike Schmitz or read a book from Father Jacques Philippe or any other solid book, start your prayer with that content. It can lead your conversation with God. You could talk to God about that. But so often there's other barriers in our relationship with God that prevent us from letting God heal us. One of the barriers I see a lot is having a distorted image of God. When we're children, the most powerful creatures that we know are our parents. And so on a subconscious level, we tend to believe that, well, if my parents are like this, then God must be like this too. And so my invitation there is, if you have that extra distorted image of God, is to challenge that idea, challenge those feelings. One exercise that a lot of people have found helpful is writing out everything that you think and feel about God. So often, again, you have to dig kind of deep to uncover this, but making a list where you say, I don't think God's faithful. I can't really trust him. I think he's going to abandon me, or he doesn't really care about me. I feel like he's not going to come through for me. Like, write all that out and then ask the question, is it actually true? And the only way you can answer that question is by getting to know the real him. And you can do that through the scripture, through the saints, and through the sacraments. And then also ask him to heal the idea that you have of him inside of you. Another barrier is feeling abandoned by God. So often the young people that I work with really struggle with this. I know I did. I know I had to ask the question for years, like, God, when my family was falling apart, where were you? Where were you? Because honestly, it felt like God was just silent. It felt like he was sitting on the sidelines watching me while I got my teeth kicked in. Where were you? And it took a lot of prayer, a lot of spiritual direction, a lot of adoration to figure out that he actually wasn't distant and silent. He was right there in the midst of it with me. He was right there with that 11-year-old Joey, sitting in the closet, crying too, saying, I don't want it to be this way. It's not supposed to be this way. I'm so sorry that you have to endure this. And what I've learned is sometimes God's only response to our pain is his presence. Father Mike Schmitz said that, and I think it's so true, that sometimes God's only response to our pain is his presence. And like John Paul II, in the midst of all that, hold on to him, draw close to him. And the final healing tip is build good friendships. Dr. Bob Schutz, who wrote the book Be Healed, among others, and he runs the JP2 Center, or Healing Center, he said that at the root of almost every wound is a deprivation of love. At the root of almost every wound is a deprivation of love. And so the antidote to our wounds is authentic love, not just in romantic relationships, but in any relationship. Authentic love truly heals us. And so build virtuous friendships. They can be healing in and of themselves. I know they have been for me. And so there's so much more that we can say. We didn't talk about forgiveness, which isn't actually one of the first steps of healing, by the way. It's something that usually comes a little bit later. We didn't talk about improving your relationship with your parents, which, if you come from a divorced or broken family, there can be some challenges there. And so the specifics might depend on your situation, if there's abuse or something really toxic. But by and large, improving your relationship with mom or dad or both can actually be very healing in and of itself as well. But in order to heal, you really need to believe that you can. Like, you won't try anything in life that you won't believe will work. And in healing, be patient. Focus on the effort, not the results right away. It's kind of like working out. If you go to the gym for 3 days in a week and the scale doesn't change, you're not gaining muscle, you could get really frustrated and discouraged. But instead, we need to focus on the effort. The results will come if we put the right effort in. And then also be courageous. Healing takes courage because it can be scary, it can be intense, it can be painful. And courage is not the absence of fear, it's acting in spite of your fear. And the real danger is that if we don't heal, we're going to continue feeling stuck. Our lives are going to lack the freedom, the love, the happiness that we all long for, that we're made for. And worst of all, we're going to pass our brokenness onto the people that we love the most. And in fact, that's one of our greatest fears, is people who come from broken families, divorced families, repeating our parents' mistakes, repeating that dysfunction in our own relationships, in our own marriages, in our own lives. Remember what Dr. Judith Wallerstein said, how the biggest area of our lives that's impacted is our romantic relationships, is our future marriages. Why is that? Basically because we don't have a roadmap for love. We've seen a broken model of love and marriage. And on a deep level, even a subconscious level, we learn how to love, we learn how to build relationships within our families. It's supposed to be the school of love. But for so many of us, if we saw a poor example of that, that example is kind of programmed into us. And so we tend to follow those same patterns in our lives. And so when it's our turn to build love, to build relationships, we feel kind of lost and we struggle in numerous ways. A lot of us struggle to doubt that love can even last at all. And so I just want you to know you're not doomed again to repeat that dysfunction. You can build lasting love. You can rewrite that programming and even build a divorce-proof marriage. And I want to offer 4 simple tips. By the way, I'm not a marriage expert. Little side note, I've been married about 5 years. I still consider myself a baby husband. And so these tips are based on research and amazing couples who have built beautiful marriages over the years. The first tip is to build virtue. If you want a great marriage, it starts with you. It has nothing to do with your relationship. Why is that? It's really simple. You, and eventually your spouse, individually, are the lid on your marriage. Your marriage will only be as healthy, happy, and holy as each of you are individually. And from the great marriages I've known and I've studied, I've learned this. The more virtuous the spouse is, the happier the marriage. The more virtuous the spouse is, the happier the marriage, always. And so learn the virtues, put them into action by practicing them. This is not something that you master right away, just like a sport or an instrument. You need to practice the virtues. The next tip is to purify your concept of love. Marriage researchers say that this is an essential ingredient if you want a great marriage, a realistic concept of love. In other words, knowing the truth about love. So often in our world, we're taught lies about love. Some of the lies that I personally fell into, which I think are a big problem for so many of us, is that I believe that love didn't actually last. Eventually, I thought it would crash and burn and would fall apart. Seeing my parents' marriage go that way, I really believed this. And even if it could last for other people out there, I didn't believe that it could last for me. But the truth that I learned is that marriage can last. Love can last. It can be very, very beautiful. I've seen it. It's been proven to me by couples that I've known. There's 2 couples in particular that have just been such an inspiration to me, just by their example, how much they love each other and their families. They've given me hope that love can last, and they've even modeled how I can do that as well. And so I want my marriage to be like theirs, and I hope you have couples like that in your life as well that can prove to you that love can last, especially if you come from a family where your parents were divorced or there was a lot of dysfunction at home and you didn't see a healthy example growing up. Love can also last because we can make it last. We can choose to make love last. Another lie that I've believed is that love is not worth the risk. It's too risky. It's not worth the possible pain, the possible hurt. And yes, it's true. If you love, if you put your heart out there, you'll probably be hurt. But you know what's worse? What's more dangerous than loving? Not loving at all. C.S. Lewis said it the best when he said, "To love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything and your heart will be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give it to no one, not even an animal. Wrap it carefully around with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken, it will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. To love is to be vulnerable." And so the danger there is that our hearts would become hard. And the truth is, love is worth the risk. Yes, there's pain involved. But if you work at it, the good can far outweigh the bad. And your life won't be easier when you choose to love, when you get married, when you give your life to your vocation. But it can be so much better. And if you struggle here, I totally get it. In high school and college, I was really paralyzed by a fear of love and relationships. And one of the things that helped me so much to overcome that fear and choose to love and love in my relationships was just being vulnerable in my friendships. Those friendships were safe, and I was able to be vulnerable in little ways to the point where I was able to pursue and date women one at a time, thankfully. But slowly, I was able to pursue my wife, right? I was able to pursue her. We got engaged, got married, and now we're building our family. We have one baby in heaven, one hair on earth. Her name's Lucy. We're just obsessed with her. We love her so much. And so if I can do it, someone who's not always so smart, then you can certainly do it too. And if you're afraid, what I would say to you is do it scared. Do it scared. Do it gradually. And by the way, don't expect your fear to disappear. I just want to add this. Don't expect your fear to just disappear. So often we think that I'll do something once I don't feel afraid. You have to act in spite of your fear, and then your fear will somewhat dissipate. And it's okay, by the way, if you have to go slower. The next step is to form healthy expectations of marriage. Research shows that if we expect marriage basically to be a fairy tale, it's going to cause a lot of problems. And to fix that, we first need to start by identifying what those unhealthy expectations that each of us have for marriage. One really popular one that I struggled with and I see a lot is believing that the purpose of marriage is happiness. The purpose of marriage is not happiness. The purpose of marriage is holiness. Nowhere in the wedding vows is happiness promised. I know it sounds super romantic, but it's so important because underneath almost every divorce is this belief that consciously or not, we expect our spouse to make us perfectly happy. And then when they don't, we ask the question, man, I wonder if I married the wrong spouse. I wonder if I chose the wrong vocation. And we might even be tempted to quit or leave. And so your marriage will suffer to the extent that you expect your spouse to make you perfectly happy. Only God can. Fulton Sheen wrote about this. Does that mean there's no place for happiness within marriage? No, there absolutely is. It's a beautiful thing to make your spouse happy, to experience all the joy that comes in marriage. But don't be fooled. Marriage is hard work. It doesn't show up in a Prime box. We've been so conditioned in our culture when we want something, we just click a button and it shows up in a few days. Not so with marriage. Marriage is more like farming. It takes time to see the fruit of your labor. But we all know that the best things in life come with hard work. Like ask any Navy SEAL, any Olympic gold medalist how they got to where they are, how they accomplished something great. It wasn't by sitting on the couch watching Netflix. They showed up every day and they put in the work, especially I would say, when they didn't feel like it. Why should we expect any less if we want great marriages? And so reiterating the point I mentioned before, a really practical thing you can do to set those healthy expectations, not just in your head, but in reality, is just to spend time with good marriages and families. Because they could really show you what it looks like to have a healthy, functional family, especially if you didn't grow up with that. The final tip here is to find a virtuous spouse. Find a virtuous spouse. What virtues are important to look for in a spouse? First, the virtue of chastity. We hear a lot about chastity. Why is it so important? At the core of chastity is self-mastery. And self-mastery gives you the ability to sacrifice for your family, for your spouse, for your children. That's essential within marriage. And also, because lust will destroy your marriage. I've seen it time and time again. Next virtue is humility. Humility is the foundation of all the virtues, but in marriage it's so helpful because it gives you the ability to apologize and to forgive your spouse. And that happens a lot within marriage. Another virtue to look for is empathy. Find someone who can see things through your eyes. And this is especially helpful in conflict. Find someone with a growth mindset. A growth mindset basically is just the belief that you can change and you can grow. You can become better. You're not stuck. And so find someone with a growth mindset. Why is that important? Because you don't just marry the person that they are today. You marry the person who they will become. And one of the greatest indicators of who they will become is their attitude and actions toward growth. And so pay attention to that. Find someone who gets you, someone who you can be friends with. Now, I'm not sure men and women will ever really get each other, but friendship is so important because marriage is so much more than romance and sex. Those are all good and important things, but they're not the ultimate measure of love or of a successful, happy marriage. Find someone that you want your children to be like, and ask that question. Do I want my children to be like this person I'm dating, this person I'm engaged to? And find someone who's on the same page on really important topics, especially these 4 topics, which researchers say that if you can find someone who's on the same page as you, you're in agreement on these 4 important topics, your chance of having a happy, successful marriage go way up. And the 4 topics are these: God, money, parenting and in-laws. God, money, parenting, and in-laws. That last one can kind of sneak in there and surprise you at times. But most of all, find someone who's pursuing God. Curtis Martin, the founder and CEO of Focus, he said it best. He said, don't pursue your soulmate. Pursue God, and after a while of running after him, turn to see who's keeping up with you. Now, there's so much more that could be said here, but if you want some great resources when it comes to love and relationships and dating and finding your spouse, Jason Everett has some really great books and talks and his podcast on dating and finding your spouse at chastity.com. Just go to chastity.com. A great book I'd recommend, too, is Saving Your Marriage Before It Starts. Saving Your Marriage Before It Starts by Doctors Les and Leslie Parrott. They're a husband and wife who have the same name. It's hilarious. One's a psychologist, one's a marriage and family therapist. Lots of good practical insights in that book. Also, my podcast, which I'll mention a little bit more about at the end. On it, we did a Love and Relationships series. We had a lot of great interviews on there. You can check that out by going to restoredministry.com, restored ministry, ministry singular, /love series, love series. And my talk tomorrow night, if any of you are able to attend or watch online, we'll go into each of these points that I mentioned and even offer more points and go more in depth to the ones that I did mention. But at the end of the day, I've heard the two things that really make love last is relying on God's grace more than your own strength and having a really stubborn, strong will. Being ready to fight for your marriage when things get hard. Because if you're like most couples, you're going to be tempted to leave. At some point, you'll want to quit. But even in the midst of that, we have to remember that even the worst marriages, even the most broken situations can be redeemed. And in that talk tomorrow, I'll mention more resources for struggling marriages. And if you want to talk about that during Q&A, we can. And just in closing, I just encourage you to seek your own healing. Commit to doing just one thing this week that you learned in this talk. And just remember that you can heal, you can grow, you can break that cycle of dysfunction and divorce, perhaps that's plagued your family for generations. And at Restored, we believe that you shouldn't have to do that alone. And so we want to help you, we want to guide you, we want to give you the resources that you need to do just that. And to find out how Restored can help you in this journey of navigating the pain and problems and finding healing, go to restoredministry.com, like I mentioned. We primarily, again, create content that makes healing simple. I want to offer two particular resources. One is our podcast. It's the top podcast for young people who come from divorced or broken families. We bring on guests who share their stories, like what they went through in their families and how they found healing and moved on from it. We also bring on experts to talk about different topics like love, relationships, navigating difficult emotions, even super practical stuff like how do you pay for college if you come from a broken family? Because again, like the research shows, we often have to pay for it ourselves, things like that. We've had over 50,000 downloads. One woman said that it's been more effective in helping her heal than 30 years of counseling. And so there's some cards in the back to any of you who are here, and then online you can just go on the website as well. My book, I wrote a book titled, and I'd humbly recommend this one, is It's Not Your Fault, A Practical Guide to Navigating the Pain and Problems from Your Parents' Divorce. And that book features 33 questions and answers on the most pressing challenges faced by teens and young adults who come from divorced or broken families. One young woman said this about the book. She said, I bought this for someone very close to me who was going through their parents' divorce as a young adult. It really, really helped him and was a major turning point in his healing journey. Highly recommend. I'm so glad this is a resource. We're selling those books in the back for $10 a piece. You can get them for $10 online as well. Again, everything online is at restoredministry.com. And I just ask you, too, to just pray for Restored. We're trying to reverse the cycle of dysfunction and divorce in our culture by helping young people, teenagers and young adults, to heal and build virtue. And so please keep us in your prayers. Thank you so much for watching this live, watching the recording, for being here in person. Count on my prayers for you. God bless you. So a little light of a crowd here, but I do want to open it up if anyone had any particular questions. I don't know if you guys are able to light up the mic if any of you had questions, and if not, that's totally fine. But we could do a little bit of Q&A if you'd like to, but we'll close it down shortly here. So any questions? I'd love to. So the question was about going to Boylan, one of the local high schools. I would love to. Yeah, I would absolutely love to do a school assembly there at some point. Whether I know it's probably short notice now for this trip, but in the future I'd be more than happy to. Please, thank you. I appreciate that. And anyone watching online too, if you have connections to retreats, conferences, schools, other churches, I'd be more than happy to work with you to bring myself or my team in. We offer workshops as well. It's something kind of new that we're offering. We do like a 6-hour workshop on healing. One of the team members that comes with us is actually a trauma therapist who's been healing trauma, helping people heal from traumas for over 15 years. And she's brilliant. She's amazing. And so that's another thing that we offer, and we'd be more than happy. Again, you can email me at joey@restoredministry.com, joey at our website, restoredministry.com, and I'd be happy to discuss doing an event with you. And thank you for mentioning that. All right, we'll keep it open for just a couple, maybe another minute or so to see if there's any final questions. Any questions online? Okay, no worries, yeah. We're recording this on a Monday night, so after the Super Bowl, so everyone's probably just recuperating from that. Cool. Good? All right, guys, all good. Thank you. Thanks again for watching, and please let me know if we can help you in any way.